How many times have you heard someone use negative reinforcement to talk about reducing the frequency of a behavior? What about psychological diagnoses and what they mean for the average person, all by a non psychology or non mental health professional? Here's your chance to learn what these words really mean and how to use them in a meaningful way, rather than adding to the pop sci mess of information we have out in the world right now. Hi, I'm Sanguinisma, and I'm currently a public policy graduate student. Before public policy, I got my Bachelor's of Science in Psychology, and today we'll be going over some psychology concepts that I've seen getting floated around, the ways they're being misinterpreted, and how to use them correctly, or for some bigger ideas, what the common criticisms from both sides of the aisle are so that you can form your own opinion about how we should go about approaching these problems. I'm sure that everyone who is like any amount of online in this day and age has seen some variation of a video that discusses something like if you have these physical symptoms or these feelings all the time, you might have ADHD, ADD, autism, anxiety, depression, or insert any other mental illness here type of video. I'm not here to dunk on the symptoms and the fact that people really do struggle with mental illness, but instead I want to focus on whether we should put so much emphasis on diagnosing people and what a diagnosis in mental health really means. First, let's talk about what a diagnosis means in medicine. Let's say you have disease ABC with the symptoms DEF, and the doctor sees those symptoms and says, aha, you may have disease ABC or disease XYZ. But first, we have to run some labs to see what organ is causing these symptoms, and depending on whether it's organ A or organ X, you have either disease ABC or disease XYZ. So you go and do the labs, you get your blood drawn, you get the x-rays done or whatever else that needs to be done. And then the doctor looks at the results and goes, yeah, organ A was a source of your symptoms, therefore it's disease ABC. Of course, medicine is a lot more complicated than that, but the basic premise here has been captured. Some core physical and observable malfunction within your body needs to be corrected, and the course of correction and behavior of your body when you are experiencing that disease are all parts of your diagnosis and the subsequent treatment. A mental health diagnosis and the treatment isn't like that. Mental health diagnoses exist based off of an established set of criteria for the diagnosis that include these complicated systems of symptoms, some of which just don't make sense in the context of each other. For example, the diagnosis for major depressive disorder includes that the individual can either sleep not at all or all the time. What other disease would it be reasonable for this to happen? In addition to this contradiction, a majority of individuals diagnosed with one mood disorder typically also meet criteria for another simply because so many of the symptoms are identical. If so many symptoms are the same, then what is the point of differentiating them at all? Not to mention, a lot of the symptoms exist in a way where the evaluation of whether someone exhibits those symptoms can become very subjective. This is because, to be blunt, the symptoms do not come from a physiological, observable understanding of human nature and biology. Instead, modern psychology exists on a practice of putting the cart in front of the horse, where we first observe the symptoms and then we never really looked further until recently. This is also part of the reason why so many psychiatric medications have such strong side effects, because we didn't look for a physiological basis in treatment until pretty recently. Again, I want to reiterate that I believe psychiatric diagnoses and medications hold value, but their context has to be heavily considered by both the practitioner and the patient, as with any other medical treatment and intervention. Instead of allowing yourself to engage in the circular reasoning of, I or someone else must have a certain mental disorder because I experience these symptoms, and I experience these symptoms because I have this mental disorder, instead ask yourself whether you might be feeling a certain way based on your context. For example, are you going through something beyond your control? And even if it is within your control, are you giving yourself the allowance to feel the strong feelings that you should be? And whether your context warrants seeking a practitioner who is able to better assess your situation, rather than diagnosing yourself based off of videos made by strangers that don't have any context as to how you're experiencing your life. I see a lot of content as well that will say something like, this thing is negatively reinforcing your behavior, and they're clearly describing punishment. I'll talk here about the difference between positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, positive punishment, and negative punishment, and some other contexts where the negative and positive contradiction is used and what it means in those contexts. First, operational conditioning is the process by which we punish or reinforce specific behaviors to, respectively, reduce or increase the frequency of that behavior. For a behavior to be reinforced or punished, three things need to exist. First, an antecedent or existing context. Second, the behavior, which exists in the context of the antecedent. And third, a consequence, your reinforcer or your punisher. To reinforce a behavior, the consequence immediately follows the behavior and its antecedent in a way that increases the rate of that behavior in the future. For example, if I wanted to increase the rate that someone bought me merchandise of Yoiseki Kanade from Project Sekai, and I knew that they really liked hugs, I give that person a massive hug whenever they bought me merch of Yoiseki Kanade. And I wouldn't give them a hug if they gave me anything else. This is also an example of positive reinforcement, because my reinforcement is introducing something new to the context, a hug, that they would not have received otherwise. On the other hand, negative reinforcement is to take away something in order to increase the rate of a behavior. For example, when my cat's ass is itchy, she is reinforced in the behavior of scratching her ass to get rid of the undesirable feeling of having an itchy ass. Here, the antecedent is having an itchy ass, the behavior is scratching it, and the consequence is not having an itchy ass. Now, this is where people tend to trip up. Negative reinforcement doesn't mean that we are introducing something undesirable to someone, even though there is something undesirable in the situation. When we introduce something undesirable, that's called punishment. I'll give one example with two consequences to demonstrate both positive and negative punishment. Let's say you have a tantruming toddler. They're crying, they're making a scene, or whatever because something didn't go the way they wanted. If we were positively punishing them, then we'd tell them off until they stopped tantruming. If we were negatively punishing them, then we'd stop giving them attention until they stopped tantruming. Of course, there are a lot of details in these examples that I'm leaving out, but the overall concept is clear. To reinforce a behavior will always mean that you are doing something to increase the rate at which the behavior appears in the future. And to punish a behavior always means that you are doing something to decrease the rate at which it appears in the future. To positively consequence a behavior means to introduce something to alter the rate of the behavior in the future. And to negatively consequence a behavior means to remove something to alter the rate of the behavior in the future. Positive and negative also hold similar meanings across other contexts of psychology. For example, the diagnosis for schizophrenia and similar psychotic conditions includes categorization of symptoms into negative and positive categories, where positive symptoms describe the introduction of stimuli or objects into a person's perception that do not actually exist, and negative symptoms describe behaviors and stimuli that should be there, but they are not. Now that you know, proceed with caution when you consume content claiming that something is being reinforced or punished, and ask yourself, is the rate of the behavior anticipated to increase or decrease, and what is being done in order to cause the change? Is something being introduced or taken away? I already touched on this a little bit, but because psychiatric medications are not developed from a physiological understanding of how mental illness exists in the human body, they pose a number of undesirable side effects and other consequences for their users. Despite this, I see frequently all this content about how getting on medication has changed someone's life, or how people talk about needing to get on medication without any disclosure of these side effects. I'm not saying that medication cannot help. I think it does in a fair number of cases. But the context and basis for prescribing medication in psychiatry needs to be considered, as it is in any other field of medicine. For example, many medications used to treat psychotic and mood disorders come with a symptom called tardive dyskinesia. We tend to brush over this symptom in regular conversations about antipsychotics, but it's really quite dangerous. It causes muscle tremors and other jerky physical behaviors that may or may not go away with time, meaning they have a real chance of becoming a permanent consequence from a temporary solution. As someone who used to work in the mental health field, I also think that we don't present this reality to patients enough, alongside the other possible side effects that someone might experience. In addition to undesirable side effects, the human body is an incredibly resilient machine, and it has an incredible capacity for building tolerance. Much of the time, medications are meant to be taken for one of two purposes, either to manage a set of symptoms or to resolve them permanently. When we prescribe something to address a disease, it should fall into the second category. But because mental illnesses are so poorly defined, they fall into this middle ground between the two categories, and people probably end up taking them longer than they need to and longer than they should. In this situation, we build up an incredible tolerance for things that are really not all that different from illicit and dangerous substances in the realm of stimulants like Adderall or Ritalin and tranquilizers, to the point where people continuously increase the dose of these medications, and along with the dosage, their predisposition to dangerous and permanent side effects. Again, I'm not saying these things to deter anyone from getting a prescription, but instead to also consider what the possible consequences of these medications are, and whether you are getting a full and educated opinion, or if you might want to seek a second opinion, as you always should do when you are making a medical decision. I know a lot of what I talked about really questions the fundamentals of modern psychology as a practice, and may be somewhat jarring for some of you who do not have a deeper understanding of psychology beyond what we see as part of popular culture or popular science. I want to reiterate again, I am not questioning the validity of psychology and the social sciences, but rather I want to equip you all with the information necessary to critically analyze what can be made better in your experience, learning about, or working through your own psychological problems. Some resources that I want to point out are the Mad in America website run by the journalist Robert Whitaker, who is widely acclaimed in the field of medical and scientific journalism. He also has 2 books, which I highly recommend reading, on the commercialization of psychiatry and how it has created a myriad of social problems that we still suffer the consequences of. These books are Mad in America and Anatomy of an Epidemic. If you're interested in learning more about behavioral psychology, browsing the internet is a brilliant way to start, and there are some textbooks out there that describe basic principles of behavioral psychology quite well. However, as the field is still growing, there are some struggles as to defining terms and their relationships. In the meantime, you can look up some of the foundational scientists of behavioral psychology, such as Edward Thorndike, B.F. Skinner, and John B. Watson, while comparing their contrasting and similar opinions about the scientific nature of human behavior. Thanks for watching, and as always, I'll see you next time.